here from Manchester University, and I'm going to hand over to them now to start their presentation. Okay, Anja?
Yeah.
I'll put you on spotlight.
Right. Can you all see that? Good. Okay. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming, and thank you to the Parent Infant Foundation for inviting us. We are hoping to present to you our findings from a review of the literature of manualized attachment-based interventions, and we had a particular focus here. We really wanted to find out what the evidence of these interventions was really for improving the caregiver-infant relational sort of outcomes. So that's what we're going to do today. Let me just see if I can. Here we go. Okay.
So hi everyone, I'm Chloe Crompton. I'm very newly qualified perinatal clinical psychologist working in the perinatal community mental health team in Blackburn. So I did this project as part of my doctoral thesis at the University of Manchester, where Anja was my research supervisor.
And I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. And as Chloe just said, most of my job there involves supervising trainees. So these are clinical psychologists in training. And most of my research interests are within the perinatal mental health field. And that, of course, covers infant sort of well-being as well. I also work very part-time on a mother and baby unit at Manchester. It's called the Anderson unit. And I do various sort of different jobs as well. For example, I'm a committee member of the BPS at DCP, that's the Division of Clinical Psychologists, Faculty of Perinatal Psychology, and we always welcome new members as well. Since September last year, I've actually become the director of the Perinatal Mental Health and Parenting Research Unit at the trust that I work for as well. And I've put up the website if you're interested. We have a newsletter and information coming out. And Chloe's project certainly fell within this. We also wanted to acknowledge our sort of third person, and that is Ming Wei Wan. She's a developmental psychologist also at the University of Manchester. And Ming and I, we've been meaning to do this type of review for quite a while. I actually checked back through my records, and I think we tried to get funding for it back in August 2018, which we didn't get. But we got Chloe instead, and we convinced her when she came to us to do her empirical study to maybe take this project on. So we've just submitted this for review to a journal. So it's not been published, and you are going to be the first ones to really hear the results of this.
So I guess first we're just going to talk a little bit about the theoretical and literature background, and then we'll move on to discussing some more of the procedural stuff we did, and then the results and the highlights of the review as well. So we know that the first 1,001 days are extremely critical and important in terms of infant social, emotional, cognitive and physical development. And we know that the relationships and interactions that an infant has with their caregivers is really significant as well. So attachment theory sort of provides the framework for understanding those early relational experiences and how those interactions and relationships help build a blueprint for how the infant understands themselves and others and how they understand the world, as well as providing them with skills in terms of dealing with stress and adversity and regulating their emotions. So with all that in mind, and the extreme importance of those early times for an infant, there's been quite a lot of specialised attachment-based interventions that have been developed, and the aim of those is to help bring the improvements to the caregiver-infant relationship. And they do that through targeting sort of lots of different relational processes in terms of caregivers and infants attachment or caregiver sensitivity, attunement, responsiveness, and just looking at them caregiving behaviours and interactions. So when I was sort of doing a review of the existing literature, I found that there were numerous existing systematic reviews and meta-analyses in terms of the effectiveness of attachment-based interventions. And those findings did demonstrate that the interventions work and that they really help the caregiver-infant relationship and the relational processes, and there's positive outcomes on that. But I guess one of the things that also came up in terms of looking at that literature is that the study quality was quite poor. So then I guess that isn't quite so great, because then can you trust the findings of a study that isn't really conducted very well?
So whilst we were developing the sort of wider scope of this review, we initially, Ming and I initially wanted to cover parenting interventions, attachment-based intervention, basically any sort of intervention you could offer to a mum, a dad, or any other caregiver and their infant. We also had a lengthy discussion about the inclusion or exclusion of video feedback. So video feedback, Ming was often telling me this rather a technique rather than an intervention, but I'm certainly aware of interventions being built around this, like a video interactive guidance, for example. And we then took the decision that we are not including these types of interventions that are solely using video feedback. We did include interventions that might have used video feedback as one aspect of the sort of wider sort of intervention scope. So we put up some reviews here that we know of in terms of video feedback. And I should say that once our paper comes out, I rather hope that they will have retained all the appendices, because we've done wonderful appendices linking all the studies we've excluded and reasons why in the appendices, so people can really see the processes that we underwent through. So just a word of warning here, if you're thinking of video feedback, we're not really covering that so much.
So yeah, what was the point in this review? Why was it needed, especially in terms of clinical practice? So I think Anja's already highlighted that the topic of the review came from a lot of our own clinical interest in terms of the perinatal period and infant wellbeing and attachment. Within perinatal and parent-infant services, though, there's sort of this huge push for lots of funding that's going to be coming in terms of the long-term plan and the 5-year forward view of mental health. So there's going to be multi-billion-pound investments into those kinds of services and developing those services, especially around increasing the availability and access to therapies and interventions, and increasing that from 12 months after birth to 2 years after birth. So I guess as a review team, we sort of wondered how a review topic such as this would help guide those service developments and the plans that are fitting in with this long-term view.
Absolutely. As I said, we were particularly interested in the perinatal period and what interventions were out there. Having worked in this area for a while, that was a real passion of mine. But of course, there's also the scientific argument, if you like. So for me, it really was a question of what interventions actually exist that could be offered by services to address the sort of perinatal needs that might be there in parents who are pregnant or expecting their first child or even another child, or who have a very young baby or even a sort of young infant. So first of all, we were really wondering about what interventions exist that might be addressing that particular age range. And then we had quite a lengthy debate about whether these are attachment-based interventions, because from my reading and knowledge of the literature, sometimes people call themselves parenting interventions rather than attachment-based. I mentioned that Ming is a developmental psychologist. She's very interested in attachment, and I think there was a compendium of parenting interventions. It's a US compendium, so it was done. It's a very nice document. If you want to Google it, it's a very nice document. It's a bit outdated now. And even in there, you can really clearly see that they're not always parenting interventions if you take a strict definition of parenting and attachment-based interventions. And they've amalgamated all sorts of different things. So we actually wanted to shine a light on and really assess whether the interventions that we were going to include really fitted with our definition of attachment-based. And then the next step was really, should we just go for anything, any sort of therapy that's been developed? And we ended up deciding that we really wanted to go for interventions that have a manual underpinning it. We wanted to have the manualization really, because that ensures that training can be delivered quite effectively, that people have a manual maybe in terms of how to deliver the intervention, and the rollout within services could be guaranteed much more so. So that's why we ended up with these. And then the next step was the decision that we needed to make was, are we then going to collect all evidence? So any study that might have reported on some sort of outcome of these interventions, or should we really home in on the relational aspects? And Chloe already mentioned those quite a bit. And we ended up deciding, because there are these other reviews in this area, and we were anticipating, because we didn't get the funding for this particular call back in the day, we anticipated another review might be covering that. So we really wanted to look at the evidence-based for interventions if they were assessing some sort of relational outcome. And most of us might be familiar with Annette Bauer and colleagues' report on the economic cost of perinatal mental health. And the costs of implementing maybe interventions that are quite low in effectiveness have been suggested to be rather high and potentially detrimental to infants, because they might not necessarily bring about change. So that was another driver that we were considering here. And as I said, Ming and I had started doing sort of preliminary searches, and we realized that there hadn't really been a sort of systematic review within this area, and we felt we were really addressing a gap. Some of the reviews that Chloe referred to might be particularly older children, for example. So we really wanted to look at this area, which meant we had two main aims. So one was really, we wanted to provide and established, I guess, first of all, an overview of what manualized attachment-based interventions were out there. And we wanted to be able to give this overview from conception or pregnancy through to the child turning 2 years old, to really cover the sort of service developments that were happening in the UK. And then the second step was, once we've done the sort of search for all the interventions that might be out there, we really wanted to find out what studies actually show that there might be benefits to these, particularly, as I said, in terms of improving the parent or caregiver and infant relational outcomes. And this ended up being the 2 stages of our review, which make it a little bit more complicated than ordinary systematic reviews. And I'm not going to necessarily tell you too much about the ins and outs of how to do a systematic review, but I wanted to highlight that it felt a little bit like we were shining a torch under the bed, but we followed all the relevant guidance. So we registered our review on a particular database called Prospero. We also looked whether there are similar reviews being done in this area, so we're not duplicating anybody's work. And we followed Prisma guidance as well. And I'll show you some Prisma diagrams. We searched, it was mostly Chloe who searched the literature using the databases that are the most relevant, I would say, for perinatal sort of mental health research. And of course, the study was started much, much earlier. So we did our first sort of comprehensive search in January 2020, and we very recently updated it prior to submitting it to a journal. We decided to go or to look for just the literature that was published in academic journals. So we weren't interested in reports that somebody might have uploaded to the internet somewhere. So they had to be sort of academic sort of papers that we wanted to go for. And we restricted our search to English papers or papers published in the English language. And as you will see in a moment, that introduced a little bit of a bias. But we didn't restrict for year of publication. So even if the intervention was quite old, we were quite happy to include it. And of course, whilst we were trying to establish our list, this is the first stage, we were also consulting with people in the area. We were looking at the existing reviews, at the reference lists, if there was anything that we might have missed to our searches. So we tried to be as comprehensive as we could be.
Yeah, so just a little bit more on the inclusion criteria in terms of the interventions that we were looking for stage 1. So as Anja's already touched upon, it had to be what our definition of attachment-based intervention was, that was looking at caregivers and infants from conception to 2 years, so looking in that perinatal period. And obviously with us looking at manualised attachment-based interventions, it had to be an inclusion criteria that it had to be a manual included. So I guess clearly defining what attachment-based intervention meant was quite challenging process, really, I would say. So we gave quite a lot of consideration to the definitions that are already existing in the literature, especially around the definitions between what is an attachment-based intervention and what is a parenting-based intervention. I guess when we did come up with our definition, which you can see there with the final 2 bullet points on the slide, is that we didn't want to be overly narrow. We wanted to capture, give a meaningful synthesis to it. So we wanted the intervention to be fundamentally based on the principles of attachment theory, so enhancing containment, reciprocity, sensitivity, attunement, responsiveness, and those internal representations that the caregiver has of their relationship. And we also needed the intervention to be targeted and aimed at changing the quality of the caregiver and infant relational processes and the relationship and the attachment. I guess throughout the screening and early searches, we also had to make some additional considerations and in terms of excluding interventions. So just with regards to the parenting interventions, we sort of define those as being based upon the principles of social learning theory. So looking at praise, reward, limit setting. And we excluded those because we found out during those early searches, and Anja's also sort of done a bit of work in this area as well, that a lot of them target children that are over 2 years old. So we excluded those for that reason mainly. And we also excluded interventions that were specifically aimed at caregivers of children and infants with neurodevelopmental disability or learning disability or physical disability, just because I guess the literature tells us that those caregivers and infants would have quite a distinctly different experience of the intervention. And I guess drawing upon our own clinical experience as well, we sort of knew that interventions can be adapted to suit the needs of the population. So I guess for those reasons, those interventions were excluded as well, just to help us give a meaningful synthesis.
Absolutely. So this is one of the Prisma diagrams that you have to do in order to try and publish your findings. And as you can see here, it involves quite a lot of searching, lots of records that you might identify, lots of sort of duplicates in different databases, and you whittle things down. And so I wanted to draw your attention to this really, that in the end, we identified about 80 potential interventions that might be included. And Chloe very quickly flagged up to us that some of them seem to have a very clear name, while others don't. So they might have been just idiosyncratic interventions that were being developed without necessarily a name. And what we ended up doing is we looked through those interventions that we initially identified, and then looked and compared our inclusion and exclusion criteria, whether we could include them, whether they met what we really were looking for. So again, we had to exclude quite a few interventions here, sometimes because there wasn't a manual available, or on closer inspection, we found that they were actually video-based interventions only, rather than having a sort of combination of different techniques. So again, we were quite transparent. For systematic reviews, you have to be, and we ended up with 27 attachment-based interventions that we wanted to include. And we're going to tell you a little bit more about those now.
So yeah, you can see that the results from stage 1, we had about 40 years worth of interventions that we found, so from 1979 spanning to 2019. And you can also see that most of them were developed in the UK and the USA, but as Anja touched upon earlier, that might have been because of the language restriction that we placed upon the searches. So I guess that's just something to be mindful of as well. can you just press the slide, Anja, so the next bit comes up as well?
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, so you can see that as well from this, that they were really diverse in terms of the delivery, either on an individual or dyadic basis, in a group setting, home visitation or community location, and also quite varied in terms of the number of sessions and the length of sessions as well, which I guess is nice to see that there is such wide variation across these different interventions, and I guess is also beneficial for people who are considering implementing these interventions into the services. So then you can look at these results, and what we've put in the manuscript is a lovely big detailed table that has all this information for you, but you can think about what fits the population that you're working with, or what would fit with the service that you work in, and would that intervention be a right fit for you, I guess.
Absolutely, and as Chloe touched upon there, we have a wonderful table in our paper that we've written. We couldn't reproduce it here because it spans about 15 pages or so, but it's incredibly detailed. So let me just introduce you then to the first of two slides highlighting some of the interventions, and we've put some links up there. You can see maybe the country it was initially developed in as well. I was very, very keen to see those, to see how many of those I would actually recognize, having been in the sort of perinatal field for a while. So here I would flag up Circle of Security. That's been around for a while, and it's one that I often come across when I go to sort of particularly World Association of Infant Mental Health Congress, for example. They often have presentations on Circle of Security. The other ones that I was more familiar with was the Mellow range, the Mellow Babies, the Mellow Bums, the Mellow Parenting, having collaborated with some of these people, and Christine Puckering trying to introduce me to the Mellow Parenting coding system as well. So lots of different ones. Some of them you might recognize. A lot of them weren't necessarily familiar to me, which I thought was quite interesting. This is the second slide then of all our interventions that we've had here. And the one that I was most familiar with was the Solihull approach. Again, a lot of conferences I go to, there's often a Solihull stand. Wait or Watch, Wait and Wonder is the other one that people have mentioned to me a number of times and spoke of really highly. And also, of course, there's the parent-infant psychotherapy from the Anna Freud Center as well. So lots and lots of different ones that we've identified. Okay. So now we're moving into the sort of second stage of what we were doing. So as I said, we had the first stage where we searched for what interventions are out there, and now we had identified these 27, and we now needed to find a way of identifying the literature that might have been published in, as I said, peer-reviewed journals, mostly academic ones. And we adapted our methodology slightly. So we went back and had to do a second search. So this would occur slightly later. Again, we were looking for English studies only, or published in English, I should say, because we needed to really understand what they were saying, and we didn't have money for translation. So that's what we did. We, of course, also here looked at any sort of existing reviews that we were aware of. So we were searching for additional maybe evidence there. Every paper we found, we would search the references list there. Anything we came across, we were trying to sort of implement and look at. Okay.
I also emailed a lot of the intervention developers to see if there was any research that had been conducted that would be eligible for inclusion. So yeah, just a bit more on the inclusion criteria. We followed what's called the PCOS framework for the stage 2. So that's population, intervention, comparison group, outcome, and study design. So we really wanted to be quite broad as well, so we could just capture as much empirical evidence as possible to help meet the aims of the review, to determine, which interventions were effective in improving relational functioning. So I guess just to mainly draw your attention to the outcome in the inclusion section, is that it must include a relational measure of the dyad. So I think we've sort of highlighted that that was really important for this review in particular. And I guess it was something that made it quite novel as well and different. A lot of the other existing reviews, sort of their inclusion criteria was more on the study design. So it must be an RCT or something like that, for example. But it was that made this review a little bit different. And drawing your attention again to the exclusion criteria column in the population and the outcome boxes. So the early screening and searches identified that many of the studies included child and infant samples that sort of had partial amount that were over 2 years old. So we sort of sat together as a review team and thought about what impact that might have on the findings. So we set then this criterion of 50% in terms of 50% of the sample had to be under 2 years, and including up to outcome as well.
Yeah, that was quite a tricky decision that we needed to take there, because you would be quite surprised, or I was surprised, that people often don't give the proper sort of age range, or a medium, or tell you a little bit more about the population that they worked with. So we often had to do guesswork. But yeah, that's what we opted for. And as Chloe said, we wanted to be as inclusive as possible. At one stage, we were also considering whether we should include qualitative data. So those might be interviews that maybe have been done with the parents who have been offered this intervention, or even healthcare professionals who were involved in the delivery. But we then decided that would be beyond the scope of what we were actually trying to do. It was just too much work. So that might be something we will catch up on at some stage. So here's the second sort of Prisma diagram. Again, just illustrating the sort of underpinning processes that you have to do to get to where you want to be in order to review the literature appropriately and consistently. So we ended up with quite a number of records, and 107 had to be screened quite carefully against our inclusion and exclusion criteria. And again, that's not an easy thing to do. We often had sort of discussions: should this paper be in, should this paper be out? Do we have enough information? And as Chloe said, she was often chasing authors as well if there wasn't enough information, or we wanted to clarify issues so we could include the paper potentially. So we really did a lot of work behind the scenes in order to get the sample of 40 studies that we had. Okay.
So I think it's sort of a requirement now for every systematic review that's conducted that a quality appraisal has to be conducted. So we did it for the stage 2 process, just because that was when we were looking at the study part of the review, and we used the quality assessment tool for studies with diverse designs, or the QuATSD as it's otherwise known as, which we did because we realised there was loads of diversity in terms of the study methodology and designs when we were sort of conducting the pilot and early searches. So what this is, it's a 16-item checklist, and it has a 4-point rating scale. So I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with it or if you've used it before. I guess one thing to be mindful of is that it has been critiqued in the past for not addressing certain aspects of study designs, for example, randomisation or blinding. But we did, just to emphasise that we did hold these in mind, and we did consider these elements during the analysis part of the review. And what we found from this tool was that we didn't have any studies that were rated as poor quality, which is quite contrary to what the existing review literature says, and most of our studies were rated within the good range, with a select few as well that were rated as high quality.
Absolutely. So as Chloe touched on there, when you're looking at, if you like, the evidence base for any sort of intervention, you often go to a design called randomized controlled trial, or RCT. And most people prefer just to do reviews on RCTs, whereas I actually prefer to do reviews that are a bit broader, because I often know that the literature I'm looking at, there might not be enough. So that's why we use this particular quality appraisal tool to capture everything, really. Okay.
So what did we find from stage 2? I guess that we found that there was 17 of the interventions that had studies that met our review inclusion criteria. So this meant there was 10 interventions that didn't have any eligible evidence, which I think Annie's going to discuss on the next slide. So I guess just the key point from this table is that these interventions reported on a relational outcome of the caregiver and infant dyad. So I'll just give you a moment to possibly look at those and think about if there's some you might know, or if you might feel surprised about any of them that are there or any of them that are not there. I guess for me, when I was doing this part of the review, I was expecting there to be loads of studies for parent-infant psychotherapy in particular, I guess, and I don't know if that's just because I know a little bit more about it. So yeah, that was a surprise for me. Yeah.
So you've had a minute to maybe process what was being shown here, and I'll take you to the next slide. Because what I wanted to emphasize again, because very often when we had sort of meetings and we were discussing the findings, we often said, oh, there's no evidence. And I kept saying, no, there's no evidence for what we were looking for. There might be evidence. There might be far more studies out there supporting maybe that a parent's well-being might improve after the intervention. But we haven't looked at this. Our review really was interested in any sort of outcome in terms of improving the caregiver-infant relationship. And we identified that there were 10 interventions that we couldn't find any studies that really matched our criteria. So there might be wonderful evidence out there about these sort of interventions, but they haven't addressed the parent-infant outcome. And this one was the ABC one, was the one that had the most studies that were actually eligible for our review. It had 9 studies, and 7 of those were actually randomized controlled trials. So this intervention looked the strongest in terms of what we were particularly looking for. That doesn't mean to say that's necessarily the best, it just looked the strongest on that. And as Chloe already said, we did try and go the extra mile, if you like, and emailed as many developers as we could to see if there was anything that we might have missed, if there was anything maybe in preparation, in press, for example, that hasn't been published yet, but would be imminently published. And indeed, for some developers were indicating that that was the case, or that studies were currently being done and the evidence will come out eventually. So this is very much still a developing sort of field. And maybe just watch out if you're particularly interested in an intervention, just keep watching the field.
So yeah, we found that we did get quite a mixture of the different types of studies. So we had 22 randomized controlled trial designs, 19 of which were full RCTs and 5 which were pilot RCTs or feasibility studies, I think they're also known as, aren't they? And yeah, the quality of these was also varied. So we had the number of study design that was varied and the quality of these varied. But again, most of the study qualities was in the good range, which I guess is good because that means that we can trust the evidence and trust the findings.
Mm-hmm.
So something else that was quite varied as well, I guess, is the relational outcomes that were measured and how these were measured. There was various different types of measures that were used to assess and evaluate these outcomes in terms of the intervention effectiveness. So you can see from this slide, we had 20 studies that evaluated caregiver-infant attachment, 27 studies which evaluated sort of various combinations and qualities of caregiving interaction and behaviours. So that would be things like sensitivity, responsiveness, intrusiveness. I think there was things like anger, and there was ones that did elements of caregivers and infants' behaviours as well. There was 5 studies that just evaluated sensitivity on its own. Caregiver reflective functioning was evaluated in 7 of the studies, and caregiver attachment representations was evaluated in 6 of the studies. So I guess, as you can see, it's all really different, and it's really great to see the diversity. But that made it really difficult for us to sort of capture and to analyse. I guess another really interesting finding, I think I remember, Anja, you and Ming were quite surprised about the high percentage of observer-rated measures that we used. So I guess that's really good because it shows that these studies sort of adhere to a high standard of assessing those interactions and inferences between caregivers and infants.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were so surprised because sometimes it boils down to funding. If you get funding for your study, and if there's a limit or a cap on the funding you can apply for, very often observer-rated measures are just a little bit more expensive to include. So I certainly know people sometimes avoid having that. I'm guilty of that myself at times. And that's why we were so pleased to see the sort of use of observer-rated measures. But then again, I guess we're dealing with attachment-based interventions, so maybe we shouldn't be. But it was really lovely to see.
So in terms of the effectiveness of the interventions, all of the 17 interventions had studies that reported on a statistically significant positive change in terms of the intervention working either pre to post or compared with the comparison group. I guess it's just important to be mindful of that we have put here a statistically significant change. There were also studies within the review that reported on descriptive statistics, so like percentage change, which again was positive. But yeah, I guess for this bit, we're just looking at sort of more that inferential sort of statistic version of it. So all of the studies that are included in this table showed a relational change. And even though the study quality was varied, I guess it just shows that it doesn't really matter what intervention you use, but it just does something that's positive for the caregiver and infant relationship, which is good.
Yeah. What this table also does, it gives you a little bit of an indication what particular sort of relational outcomes each study might have, or each sort of interventions might have been tested on. So, you know, from caregiver reflective function to maybe attachment representations. So that's quite a nice way of illustrating that. Okay. So we had a lengthy debate about which interventions then stood out for us, because as you would have seen in one of the earlier tables, sometimes there were only 3 studies, maybe only 1 study underpinning each intervention. So we had, and we changed our minds on this, I think, a few times. But we, of course, ended up highlighting ABC, or the attachment biobehavioral catch-up, because it had these 9 studies, of which 7 were RCTs. So we were quite impressed by that. So that certainly looks like the strongest evidence for this intervention. The other one we wanted to highlight was Minding the Baby, because they had really high quality evidence, mostly based on randomized controlled designs. However, only really 2 studies were mentioning or supporting this sort of intervention for bringing about positive intervention relational outcomes. And then the other one that we opted for to highlight was the circle of security. Again, there's only 3 studies, and 3 is apart from ABC's 9, 3 is quite a high number, as you will have seen in the table. But we liked a circle of security here because what they had actually done is they looked at not just either the US or the UK, because sometimes what we found is that these interventions were developed, particularly if they were developed in the US, they were developed for very, very specific groups. And a lot of the studies might have been done in one center only and not really sort of, been applied elsewhere. Whereas circle of security, there were studies from Australia, Germany, and the USA. And I know that there is a British study led by Peter Fonagy and Camilla Rosen in the UK, and I think it started in March this year in terms of data collection. So there will be another big randomized control trial coming out on circle of security with UK-based data. So that's really exciting to know.
So yeah, I'll just give a really very brief overview of each of those. of key interventions that we've highlighted throughout our review. So attachment and biobehavioural catch-up was developed in the USA for families that are experiencing adversity. So what this intervention aims to do, it was our understanding that it assists caregivers in understanding infant signals and providing them providing a nurturing and caring response. And it uses elements of play, video observational feedback, psychoeducation and instructional videos. Minding the Baby, another one that was developed in the USA, this one for first-time mothers who appear to be experiencing some kind of poverty. This intervention aims to develop the caregiver's reflective capacity, so recognising and responding to the infant's feelings and needs. And it does this through elements of mentalisation and some video observational feedback. Circle of Security, another one developed in America, looking at high-risk groups, so early Head Start, which I think is like child protection services within America, and irritable babies, or foster carers as well. So this intervention aims to support caregivers to develop the sensitivity by improving their observational skills, and it does this through elements of psychoeducation and instructional videos.
Yeah, and as we've highlighted in our actual paper, we have a really detailed table that will tell you what the original sort of aims of each intervention was and what was the sort of original sample that they really were sort of developing this intervention for. Okay, so to our knowledge, this is the first sort of comprehensive synthesis of attachment-based interventions that are underpinned by a manual that really covers the sort of conception or pregnancy to 2 years period. We've already highlighted that we whittled it down to 27 interventions from 80 originally, but when we then looked for the evidence base for improving parent-infant relationships or relational outcomes, we only really identified that there were studies supporting 17 of these 27 interventions. And Chloe already highlighted it. To me, what was really nice to see, it doesn't really matter which intervention we looked at, there seems to be strong support that they do lead to some sort of improvement in at least one caregiver-infant relational process. Again, when you eventually get to read our paper, you will see that the results section is very, very descriptive, because we try to really explain what was going on here. Sometimes they might have found outcomes for one, but not for another. And we should also say that we were considering if we could do some sort of meta-analysis, which is a way of statistically sort of trying to identify if there's effective sort of changes. But our data weren't really allowing that for us to do that.
I guess the thing that makes this review different as well is that whilst the existing reviews have determined the effectiveness of interventions based on the type of intervention it is, this review looks at the effectiveness of the interventions on the combined and available and I guess eligible evidence as well. So we found that the empirical evidence for each of those 17 interventions that did have the eligible evidence is really variable in terms of number, quality and design, which I think we've been able to highlight throughout this presentation. We were really pleased to see the predominant use of the observational methods that we used, which I guess have played a really prominent role in terms of caregiver-infant research and in clinical practice. And I guess it strengthens our review findings a little bit more as well, because the findings are based on like rich and precise inferences of those interactions and relationships that were observed. I guess something else that we found that was quite interesting in terms of the review findings was the differences in the quality design, and we wondered about why that might be. There is a comment paper from Fenton in 2015, I think it is, who said that the tool that we used might produce inflated scores just because of the items that are on that tool. So I guess that could explain the reason for that finding. I guess another reason is that some of these existing reviews, they used sometimes separate tools in terms of study design. So I think I mentioned that some of them are quite inclusive of RCT studies. On the Kerr and Kassar paper that's referenced in the slide, for example, they used 2 separate quality rating tools. So they used an RCT quality rating tool and a cohort quality rating tool, which we didn't do. We wanted the one tool to capture everything. I guess we've also feel like we've highlighted that there's more funding that needs to go into more studies, more RCT studies. RCTs are sort of like classed as the gold standard of conducting research and the highest level, which might speak for attachment biobehavioral catch-up as to why they've got so many RCTs if they've got more funding to be able to do that, which makes it appear that it's more effective. Or and I guess as well, it would be nice to also see sort of more of them diverse cross-cultural contexts of studies to just allow for more generalisability of the findings. And finally, as well, another interesting point of the review that we found was that pretty much all of the samples, I think, coming to mind now, there's possibly 2 that included fathers in their study samples as well, but they were all pretty much mother-infant dyads. And research and literature now is highlighting the importance of the father-infant dyad and the positive impact that that can have on infant outcomes as well within the first 2 years. So I guess some studies that look at these interventions in terms of the father-infant dyad would be beneficial as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So we've taken you through our review, and I hope you got a sense that there's lots and lots of aspects, lots of processes that underpin doing a systematic literature review. We certainly felt that we were being rigorous, structured, very transparent, and that our sort of processes could be replicated by somebody. So in 5 years' time, Ming and I might decide we're going to update on this review and get somebody else who might assist us with doing that. They can then look at what we've done and replicate it and improve on it. So we followed all of these things and have even independent coders in who weren't attached to our research team, so they didn't have a vested interest in the findings. I already highlighted that we did restrict our search to published literature and not any sort of reports or anything else really, theses maybe that somebody might have done. So there is a little bit of a bias there, but also that we restricted it to the use of the English language. Sometimes people, if they haven't really got positive findings, they might not necessarily publish in an English language journal. They might go for their native language, so that introduces a degree of bias that we need to acknowledge. We already highlighted that sometimes it's certainly easier to do a systematic review if you just have one style of or one type of design, and very often people opt for the sort of gold standard, which is the RCTs. I personally like to have more of a mixture because it just gives for more of a richer sort of understanding of what's happening. But some people might see that as a weakness, whereas I see that as a strength. So for us, it was important to include different designs. And we were really open about what kind of designs were being used, so people can look at our tables and then follow our decision making around the interventions that we've sort of deemed were useful. And we were really keen on giving a comprehensive overview as well of what's out there. And in years to come, it might be updated and maybe people only will go for RCTs, but that was what we were aiming for.
Yeah, what are the clinical implications? Why is this important to clinical practice? So I guess our review just gives a really clear overview of the manualised attachment-based interventions that were eligible, and we provide quite practical and contextual information on those. In our manuscript that we've recently submitted for journal publication that's under review, we have quite extensive appendices as well, which Anja's already mentioned. We've got a table of the excluded video-based interventions, but we've also got a table of all the other excluded interventions with the reasons as to why they were excluded, just to keep that transparency there. And just for any interested parties, really. So what we really hope is that this review just provides the guidance to healthcare professionals, commissioners, policymakers that are in perinatal and parent-infant sectors in terms of consideration of interventions for designing them or training in them, delivering them, implementing them. We have highlighted the 3 that seem the most promising. But I guess, yeah, it's important to hold in mind that there might be others that are out there that have non-relational outcomes, I guess, and that the evidence base is still developing and ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we're not necessarily advocating only use these 3. It's just they seem to have the most promising sort of evidence-based from the literature that we have seen. We certainly had a debate about, was it the UCLA intervention as well? But when you look at that, that was really only delivered in a particular healthcare center in California, I think, in UCL. And we just felt that doesn't necessarily transfer or generalize, if you like, to other settings. And it was very, very prescriptive to that one. So that's why we try to pick the ones that seem to be the most promising. But as Chloe said in our table, we have lots and lots of detail so people can really go and look and see what's most appropriate maybe for the population that they're working with. So in terms of conclusions then, we believe that our review will fill a gap in the literature, which is of course growing with the expansion of perinatal mental health services and even infant mental health services. So hopefully this will stimulate maybe debate around what interventions might be most useful. We did highlight, and I hope you get that sense that, you know, we seem to have identified lots and lots of different interventions, but not necessarily evidence bases going for each one because they might be developed for very particular sort of populations, but there is a variety out there and they are accessible and available and you can train on them, you can click on links and find out costs and all of that sort of thing. And there is evidence to support that they work. So as Chloe said, we are rather hoping that healthcare professionals, clinicians in this field and services, maybe managers, commissioners, might take note of our findings and use it as a guide to decide on what type of interventions might be most suited for the population that they're trying to serve. But we've made hopefully a bit of a plea for more studies are definitely needed. So firmer conclusions can be drawn and we can really add to the evidence base and help improve parent-infant outcomes, particularly in terms of the relational outcomes. And now we invite you to maybe voice any sort of questions or have comments maybe. We also wanted to acknowledge the help of various other people who have helped us with this and to underpin all the different processes. And we have highlighted some references, but not necessarily all that many for you here as well. So